There's a big problem with the World Cup. The event is so huge with millions of people watching to see who will win. But in order for Qatar to host the World Cup, they had to build 7 brand new stadiums, as well as a new airport and transportation, and everything needed to have it run smoothly for all these people. And to do that, they spent about $220 billion, which is over 15 times what the 2018 World Cup cost. But since the World Cup only lasts for about 29 days, what will Qatar do now that it's over? Well, there are 3 separate outcomes for their stadiums. They can either shrink it, transform it, or transport it somewhere else. But how do you move a 45,000 seat stadium? Well, it's the World Cup's first temporary stadium that will be transported to another country who needs the stadium potentially for a future World Cup. But how do they do this in the first place? Well, the way it was built has a lot to do with it. Stadium 974 was constructed using almost 1,000 recycled shipping containers, which made it very easy to assemble and then in the future, currently right now, to take it apart. Some of the shipping containers were even used as bathrooms and concessions. The idea behind the stadium was to avoid building a white elephant, which means that the stadium would become useless and actually troublesome because it would be very expensive to maintain. So they're gonna transport it soon and help keep the cost from the World Cup down. But other stadiums don't share the same fate, as Stadium 974 was the only stadium built to be transported somewhere else. Some of these stadiums are actually gonna be shrunken down instead. Because the World Cup is such a huge event, most stadiums need a capacity of at least 40,000 people, and some, especially the final, need 60 to 80,000 seats just to even be allowed to be used for the World Cup. But after the World Cup is over, they obviously can't fill that many seats, so what do? Well, back in 2018, when Russia hosted the World Cup, they had a problem with their stadiums being too small to be allowed to be used. So they added extra seating on the sides, which looked a bit ridiculous, but it allowed them to use the stadiums for World Cup, and it was very easy to demolish once it was over. But after Qatar built 7 brand new stadiums, it's not as easy to get rid of the seating the way Russia did it, because Russia built it specifically to get rid of it later. So Qatar will actually have to demolish parts of the stadium, that way they have less seats, making it easier to maintain and fill up games that aren't the World Cup. But lastly, Qatar is actually going to be solving a big problem that Russia and Brazil had when they hosted the World Cup. After the 2018 World Cup ended, Russia decided to use its stadiums and rent them to domestic teams. That way they don't have to do much renovation and the ticket sales would help pay for what it costs to maintain. But that eventually failed as Russian teams weren't well supported, not even selling half of the stadium's tickets to big matches, making the stadiums into white elephants, costing more to maintain than they even make back in ticket sales, which then cost money from the Russian taxpayers. Out of all of Russia's World Cup stadiums, only one became successful after the World Cup, which was the Kazan Arena, which got turned into a multi-purpose venue hosting not only soccer games but also concerts, car shows, and fashion shows, which helped make it into a profitable stadium, as without the World Cup they can't bring that many people in for soccer matches. But back in 2014, Brazil had a similar issue trying to turn their stadium successful after the World Cup. Brazil is one of the most passionate countries when it comes to soccer, but even then, when they rented out the World Cup stadiums to domestic teams, even they couldn't fill all the seats. And some stadiums were even losing hundreds of thousands of dollars on a monthly basis. So Brazil desperately turned one of their stadiums into a place where you can host weddings and children's birthday parties. I don't know one kid on earth who has that many friends to fill up an entire stadium. As well, they turned another stadium into a bus shelter to help keep some of the costs down. So what is Qatar gonna do in order to not fall into the same mistakes that Russia and Brazil did when trying to make their stadiums profitable? Well, Qatar is actually gonna take inspiration from the Kazan Arena in Russia, which was turned into a multi-purpose arena. And Qatar is even gonna take it a step further by shrinking down some of their stadium seating areas to transform them into giant multi-purpose arenas with new added shops, restaurants, and maybe even apartments. As well as Al Bayt Stadium is gonna be transformed into a 5-star hotel, shopping mall, and a hospital, which will bring in enough money to keep them running. But some of Qatar's stadiums will be kept for football matches, just shrunk down a lot to keep the cost down. But these stadiums aren't gonna be shrunken all all the way down, still many empty seats and losing them money. But the reason for that is Qatar is planning to host more future events such as the Asian Cup in 2024 and the 2030 Asian Games, which is an athletics tournament with even more participants than the Olympics, and possibly even hosting the actual Olympics in 2036. But since the World Cup has recently ended, we don't know how successful Qatar is going to be with its plans, so we'll have to see a few years down the road how they're doing. But they will certainly be better off than Brazil and Russia. Thanks for watching and subscribe.